Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, so in honor of Nancy Drew's 95th anniversary, I thought it would be cool to release this bonus episode of the podcast where I interviewed Jennifer Fisher. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and also congratulations to Shauna, who won my 95th Nancy Drew anniversary contest on Instagram. I hope you enjoy the books and cool items that you received, and let's get to the episode. Hey guys, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. We've got a special guest on today's episode. I thought it would be cool to do just a special bonus episode for the 95th anniversary of Nancy Drew. And so we have Jennifer Fisher on today's episode. And so for those of you who don't know, Jennifer is president of the Nancy Drew Sleuths fan club, and she actually runs a website, which is nancydrewsleuth.com. And it's just a treasure trove of information. If you guys have ever wondered anything about Nancy Drew, you should definitely check that out. And she also organizes a yearly Nancy Drew convention based around one or several of the books. And she also incorporates some of the Nancy Drew Her Interactive games into those conferences, which is really cool. She has also consulted on numerous Nancy Drew projects and merchandising. And one project that some of you may be familiar with is the 2007 Nancy Drew movie starring Emma Roberts. And also, Jen, I feel like this is just like such a long introduction because you've done so much, but she's actually donated an entire Nancy Drew collection to the Toledo Library in Ohio. So it's got books, memorabilia, advertising, and so much more. So Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to ask you some questions. So as me and Jen were talking before we started recording, I was like, I've got a ton and we may not get to all of them, but I'm excited to see what your answers are on some of these. So the first question I have for you, Jen, how did you get into Nancy Drew and what are your earliest memories of her?
So my earliest memories are, I believe, probably around when I was 7 or 8. And I can remember getting a book from a childhood friend, and I believe it was Mystery of the Glowing Eye. But I also had them at my school library because they had like this whole big area where they had like books like Nancy Drew. And it was also an area where we often would go and sit at the library for special programs or whatever. We'd all sit on the floor. And I would always sit by the Nancy Drew books. And I probably sat there and looked at them a little bit instead of paying attention like I was supposed to. But I checked out a lot of books from my school library. I just always loved mysteries. And so, Nancy Drew was just such a fun, exciting character, I think. And it just, they resonated with me on that level that they were mysterious and she had fun adventures, but she was very smart and could save the day and, all those fun things kids love to read about. And so that's kind of how I got my start in my earliest memories.
Oh, that's so cool. I love that you checked them out at the library first, because I think for me, I started getting them as like birthday gifts and Christmas gifts from my mom and my grandmother. And then I started seeing them at the library and I was like, oh, I haven't read that one yet. So that's really cool.
Yeah. My mom was an avid reader as well, though she didn't read Nancy Drew growing up. But we would go to the bookstore, and so I would get books that way too. But I did check out a lot of them through the library. So I have a huge fondness for library editions now.
Oh, yeah. And for those of you that can't see, since we're doing just an audio podcast, Jen has just this huge array of Nancy Drew books behind her. And I guess is it the red, blue, green, and yellow that are the
ones
editions?
Like we hear a bunch of library editions on that shelf.
Those are so cool.
Thank you. They're so colorful and just so many different types that I think it makes it fun to try to collect those. Some collectors are a little snotty about library editions. They want pristine mint books or whatever, or if they want a library edition, it has to be completely mint, or they don't want it used in a library. And I don't know, those are hard to come by, like unused library editions, but I kind of find it charming that they look used and they have those cute little stickers with the mystery guy or the question mark or whatever they're using for the little labels on the spines. But I find them charming like that, because it shows they were well read and well used.
Yeah, I was going to say it'd probably be pretty hard to find those without some kind of defects or little quirks to them, because, they were well loved by kids and checked out
library all the time. So,
Right.
which is what you want. So,
Right. Exactly.
now, I think you kind of already answered this question a little bit. You said you had read the Glowing Eye mystery, but do you remember the first Nancy Drew book you ever read? Was it that book or a different book?
I actually don't remember the first one I ever read, but
Okay.
I'm guessing it was probably that one, and that was
Mhm.
kind of a wacky book. But I always remember Old Clock and Hidden Staircase, and I've always been a person that liked to read in order, even if you don't necessarily have to.
Mhm.
So I'm guessing I sought out book 1 and 2 and probably started that way, because number 2 was always my favorite of all of them, or one of my top favorites.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've liked about doing this podcast is reading them in order, and I just stuck to that because it's neat. You can catch little details that you're like, oh, Nancy's car, the color changes in this edition, or it's just kind of interesting. So
Right.
let's see. So do you have a few favorite Nancy Drew books? I know you said The Hidden Staircase, Secret of the Old Clock, but from the different series, like from the Files or the later paperbacks?
That's a good question. My favorites tend to be within the classic realm, but once they switched over into paperbacks with Simon and Schuster, those early Wanderer paperbacks are some neat ones. And I always remember especially liking The Secret in the Old Lace, Lace book, because I don't know, the cover was very spooky. Nancy's kind of, they've got the spooky background, and the guy is kind of, and it's very gothic looking. And I always remember especially liking that one and that cover.
Yeah, that one is really cool. That's a pretty good book. Let's see. So now you're the president of the Nancy Drew Sleuths fan club, and you have a lot of irons in the fire, but you also run several Facebook groups. You have a website full of information on Nancy Drew, and you again organize that yearly convention. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you became president and what a day-to-day kind of looks like for you?
So I didn't set out to be president. I'll take you back to let's dive back into the mid 1990s. So around 1997, I got on the internet, and it seems crazy to be talking about it like this. I mean, we're only in 2025, but if you could believe that, like 28-ish years ago, like people were just starting to get on the internet, like mainstream. Got my first home computer, got on the internet, and I met other collectors on a message board that a friend told me about that she had visited, because she also read the books when we were growing up. And so I met some collectors on there, and it was like an old rudimentary message board that it wasn't like an email type thing. It's just you posted on a message board.
Oh, cool.
And there was a lot of train wreck, crazy squabbling going on among some collectors on this group, and it was kind of bizarre. So another woman named Gail and I decided we would start what they were doing at the time was these e-groups, which became Yahoo groups, which is kind of defunct now, but it's like an email listserv. And so we started it. We called ourselves Nancy Drew Sleuths.
Aw, that's
And
cool.
so it was just a discussion group. We were trying to keep out the squabblers who were causing trouble on the other message board, and just have a good, peaceful, safe zone for every collector. And so we were on there. We would chat about the books. We would trade books, sell books to each other, play games, do fun stuff. And, it just started out like that. And I was called officially, I guess, a discussion group moderator was kind of the name for what you called yourself. So this was the year 2000 by the time we created this group, and calling ourselves Nancy Drew Sleuths and all. And so basically, we had some members on the group that kind of would chat with each other, want to get together maybe sometime. And one member in particular, his name was Rick. He lived near Toledo, and he had met Mildred Wirt Benson, the first ghostwriter for Nancy Drew.
Wow.
And he had her sign some books and got to talk with her. And he said, you really ought to come meet her. Because at the time she was like, in her 90s, obviously. And so, time might be of the essence when someone is in their 90s, sadly. And then so, I kind of mentioned to my mom, oh, we should go meet her. That would be so amazing. And, my mom's like, oh, someday maybe we'll. And I'm like, Mom, you don't understand. She's like 94. And then so by the next year, when she was 95, our group had decided to go meet her. And so Rick was kind of hosting us locally. And so my mom and I book hunted across the country as we drove to Toledo. And it was a lot of fun. And so about 12 of us met there in Toledo in 2001. And that was kind of what we would consider our first unofficial convention. but I'm getting
Cool.
to the point. I'm getting to the point that how I became president in this group. So I met Millie at the Toledo Blade where she works. So Rick and myself and my mom went a day before everybody else was going to be getting together with her. And so we went up to her office at the Blade, and they kind of just had kind of like a cubicle, but not exactly open. Like it wasn't like they had walls around their desk. She was next to some other people, but she just had her little desk. And she kind of dismissed Rick and my mom and just wanted to talk to me at her desk.
Oh,
she was interviewing me for her column that she was going to write about everybody visiting her.
Wow.
And so she was interviewing me for that. And then I was going to write a story about her for one of those series zines that, that were around at the time. And so anyhow, I'm interviewing her. She's interviewing me. We're chatting. She signed some of my books. It was fun. But she's working on her column and she's typing and she's asking me questions. And she's like, now, what role do you have? And so she wasn't on the internet herself. So she was trying to figure out what my role was in this discussion group. And I told her I was the discussion group moderator. And so she was like, it didn't sound good to her for whatever reason. It didn't seem strange. Like she wasn't familiar with all of that. So she goes, I'm going to make you more official. We're going to call you the president. And I remember sitting there going, wait a minute. I'm not president of all this. I'm just a discussion moderator. But she insisted, and that's how I became the president of Sleuths. Wow. Thanks to Millie. It was hilarious. But so everybody's like, oh, yeah, you can be the president. And then they wanted to kind of organize ourselves more where we did this yearly and we had these conventions and, we get together. And so it just snowballed from there. So then we kind of officially organized, and then next year we had another convention and it just went from there. And anyhow, that's how I became president of Nancy Drew Sleuths, thanks to Millie.
That's amazing, from Millie herself. That's so
I know.
cool.
It is a kind of a cool story. It was a neat moment to be able to meet her and get to talk to her about all of this. And I some of it was really nice. I know she appreciated that we all, appreciated what she did and how she wrote these books, and they were inspiring and all. But at times I think she just still couldn't get what the fuss was all about in a way, because this was just a job to her back at the time. And over time she came to realize that it meant a lot to a lot of people. So.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Just as an author, I'm sure to realize wow, these books have had that much of a legacy that generation after generation is reading them. So that is cool.
Right.
And so you kind of touched on the conventions again. So speaking of the conventions, have you had a favorite one that you've put on? And is there a specific book or game that you would love to theme around for a future convention?
That's a good question. So all of them I love. It's like I almost have to try to top myself every year and make it even better. But all of them have been so fabulous. But some of my favorites probably would be, well, meeting Millie at that first unofficial, that's probably hard to top, right?
Yeah.
And then I would say our first convention in New Orleans and the second one we had were favorites because I just love going to New Orleans.
Yeah.
It's such a great town and such a great place to visit. Another favorite was when we went to Maine for the Tolling Bell convention. That was really cool. Kind of because we picked Ogunquit, and that was kind of like the dupe for Candleton in the book. I mean, everything was laid out. There was all these similarities. It was like somebody had been there to then, come up with this. So we loved that one. It was beautiful. And then I really loved our Key West convention down in Florida. That was so much fun. We had a very small group that year. And so we all just really hung out. We got to get to know each other better than you do at some of our bigger ones. So yeah, we had a fabulous time. I was snorkeling in the dry Tortugas. I mean, I would never have thought I would do something like that, but that was so much fun. So that was definitely a big favorite. There's just been a lot of them. So for games, the last few years we've been trying to incorporate the games in the convention, because we did, when we were in Maine, we kind of combined that, and then we basically when we went to Salem, that was a big one because we had midnight in Salem. Yeah. And then when we were in Sleepy Hollow last year, we had Warnings at Waverly Academy. That was cool. And I've always loved the Nancy Drew ghost stories. So coming up this fall in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, we are bringing in Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake.
Oh, that's
So
perfect.
that's going to be so much fun. And I'm really looking forward to that one. You were asking what I was looking forward to with a game mixed in. Definitely that one. So we're working on that one right now. We're about to have registration available for people to start registering. And it's
Yeah.
just, it was fun. I love the ghost story and the ghost stories book that's based on. And then there was like that digest paperback Mystery by Moonlight. I guess the game was slightly based on as well, or
Yeah.
inspired by. So yeah, it's been fun to take those and try to create an activity there at the convention based on those.
That is cool. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake is a favorite game for a lot of people, and a lot of people do love the Ghost Stories book, so that is a perfect choice.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to be fun. It's just one of those ones that it's different to bring in like a ghost story when it's just a story as part of a regular set of books with more stuff in it, rather than just a full book. It's just one little story, but it's got a lot of good stuff in it to bring to life. So.
Yeah. Now, I sort of touched on this in your introduction, but you donated an entire collection of Nancy Drew books and memorabilia to the Toledo Library, of course, being the town where Mildred Wirt Benson, the ghostwriter, spent a lot of her formative years. Can you tell us a little more about how the idea for the collection originated and what it was like finding all the different pieces for it?
So I had been collecting this collection from around 1997 onward. Around that time when I was getting online and finding other collectors, I'd been out to a used bookstore and an antique mall, and I discovered some of the older books, especially in this antique mall. I found an old copy of Hidden Staircase, blue with orange silhouette, and I didn't have any clue what the heck this was because I grew up reading the Yellow Spines and the revised versions and everything like that. That kind of spurred my interest. I got all my childhood books, which I still had at my parents' house. And of course, I had a lot of gaps because I had checked out a lot at the library, so I didn't have every book. And then I had the paperbacks I was reading in the Nancy Drew Files books, which I always liked because they came out right when I was in middle school, high school. And so it was like my target age, and I love those. So I got all those, and then I started going to bookstores and antique malls and having fun kind of adding to that. So basically 1997 on, probably it was around 2015-ish, maybe. I can't remember exactly. But we had an event in Toledo. And we'd had several events in Toledo over the years. Like we had that first unofficial convention. The next year when Millie passed away, we held a memorial type event for her that fall in Toledo at the library. We had a presentation, and Rick did a big display of all his Millie books. And then we came back. I'd been back at different times over the years for research because I'm writing a biography about Millie. But 2015, we had this anniversary event there in Toledo. We had several historic anniversary mini cons, we called them that year. So one of ours was in Toledo. And, the library was always phenomenal. It's the downtown main library, and it's just beautiful. The architecture, everything, it's just gorgeous. And the children's section was always super cool. They had interactive elements. They had like a giant aquarium in there. They had like half a car coming out of the wall the kids can get inside, and cool like interactive elements to it. And then just a beautiful part of the library. And then they have like a gallery of original children's book art that they collect. All kinds of different children's book art, including the Shadow Ranch Tandy Nancy Drew painting that they had acquired. So there's all this cool stuff going on in the children's area. And, with the connection for Nancy Drew to Toledo, because Millie had written books 17 through 25 and number 30 there in Toledo, and spent decades there of her life after living in Cleveland for a bit after moving from Iowa. It was a great connection to her. They had some of her items there at the library. Rick had given or sold his big Millie collection of all the books that Millie had written to the library, and they were in the rare book room. So her 135 published books were all there. And so there was just a big connection. And I had noticed this giant section of wall that had nothing on it in this one area. And I thought, someday they could put cases there and I could donate my collection possibly. So I reached out to one of the women there at the library named Nancy. And I mentioned, I said, do you think the library might be interested in having my collection someday? And of course, Nancy was like, yes, of course we would. And so I didn't think anything much about it after that. But it gave me when you have a collection like mine that's just beyond huge and it's hard to catalog. It's hard to keep up with. It's hard to archive properly.
Mhm.
And you've collected past the books and the collectibles to all this ephemera and historical items, because I always sort of wanted it to tell a story and talk about that history behind it and just be more than just the books and collectibles. It became a thing bigger than itself, bigger than me, bigger than this house. And so it just gave me a little peace of mind there might be a home for it and not a place for it to just sit in boxes somewhere in an archive. Like there's some university archives for series books, and a lot of them just sit in boxes. They're not out on display. They're not, and I didn't want that situation. And so basically, I figured someday, maybe I'm in my 80s, I'm retired, whatever, I'm getting rid of the collection then. I didn't think it was going to happen anytime soon. So fast forward 2019, I get an email from Nancy, and she asked me about whether I'd be considering donating right then.
Wow.
And the reason for that was they had started like at the beginning or the end of the year previous. They had started this huge renovation downtown library, and we're renovating and doing updates and just all kinds of stuff in that library. And it's even more phenomenal now. But they had the chance to carve out a space for this collection because of that, and so they could have it in the budget and they could do it. And I didn't have to donate it; they could figure it out down the road. But it was just the opportunity. And so I made the decision, to donate. And I felt like, yes, I'm going to miss this collection and spend a lot of time putting it together, but now it would have a bigger purpose and people could enjoy it. They could learn from it. Scholars and researchers could use a lot of the ephemera and the behind the scenes stuff that I've collected to, for their research or writing, or fans could be inspired. The little kids, the new generation of fans would be inspired seeing all these books. Yeah. And so I just felt like it was the right thing to do at that time. And it just happened to be a timing issue. I never thought I would donate it that early, but I'm really glad that I did. It was an interesting process. I mean, there's some ups and downs with that, but I've been totally excited and proud that it's there. And I'm so excited when fans go and visit it and they post about it and I get to see there was a marriage proposal in the room. I thought that was super cool.
That's so cool.
I know, so many fun things. And, we've had an event there since I donated. COVID happened and we were planning a big grand opening party about it. And that got put off for a couple of years. But in 2022, we finally did that. And it was fun to go and see everybody and just celebrate the collection and officially donate, grand opening of it, giving it to Toledo. But yeah, fans and people have been so excited to go see it. And it's just been a lot of fun. And now it's going to be on for 2026, there's the 250th of America's signing the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of states are doing fanfare within their state to celebrate their state and what's going on. And it's part of that. For Ohio, there's like a driving trail, and it's one of the 5 locations they picked from Toledo to put on there. So that was super neat. So there's so many neat things that are going on with this collection, but that's basically how it ended up there when it did. And because I'd only been collecting it for a little over 20 years, I don't have everything. I mean, I have all the basics. I have pretty much all the books, other than some foreign editions and library editions that I didn't have already. But I have most of the basic collectibles, but there's always something that shows up you either didn't know existed or it's super scarce. And, I just haven't had a chance to get it before or whatever. So there are items I still look forward to collect for this collection. And right now I've been boxing up stuff to send off because we're having that celebration in April. And so I've been boxing up stuff I've collected since the last time I was there to send off for it. So it's always it's always going to be evolving to a degree.
Yeah, that's cool that people are able to appreciate the collection. And that's so funny that the person that worked at the library was named Nancy. Like, that's just kismet. Like, that's so amazing.
It is. She's so nice. They've been so happy to have it. And then there's collectors that have donated some things to it. Jim McNamara donated a painting. It's the UK tolling bell. Another collector named Jamie, and we haven't mentioned this public yet, but I'm waiting on the picture of it because they've reframed it. But he donated Mystery on the Menu, one of the digest's cover arts. And that's new there. And then Mike Gowitz, another collector among the groups, he's been lending some of his art to be displayed there, and they switch out every so often. So the Tandy Secret in the Old Attic is going to be there in April when we're all there. So that's pretty cool to be able to see that again.
That's one of my favorite covers.
Is it? Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's cool.
Yeah.
Now, I know we've talked about Mildred a little bit, but I wanted to ask, can you tell us what she was like?
So before I met her, I hadn't heard a lot about her other than the basic history that's kind of out there. You know, she went to work for Edward Stratemeyer. She was hired to ghostwrite for the Ruth Fielding series, and then she went on, to get the Nancy Drew series and another series for the Syndicate. And people had talked about how she's sort of like a real life Nancy Drew, or Nancy Drew's like her. And so I kind of had that basic background of knowing that she did all of this. And then, of course, the fact that she's still working at age 95, here we are going to meet her, and she's still working. And most people are retired and doing fun non-work things, but for her, like, her work was her life. So going to meet her was like, I kind of had an idea of what she'd be like, but I didn't know for sure until I actually met her. And I just found her to be very curious, kind of like Nancy would be, but very, very intelligent, curious, still very much with it at age 95, very sharp as a tack. She was the kind of person that didn't suffer fools easily. And she was just kind of would give her opinion, maybe be a little blunt, almost like George in a way, maybe not that much, but she was very professional and businesslike at work. And she liked to live in the moment and not dwell too much on the past. That was kind of how it kept her going. And so to meet her was really neat. I think it was fun to meet her on the level of I'm writing something and she's writing something. We could connect on that level before all of the rest of the fans got there. And then it became more about her and the Nancy Drew and those sorts of things. Although she was very happy when we asked her about her other books and series, not just Nancy Drew, because, she always felt like her favorite was the Penny Parker series she wrote. And, she always thought Penny Parker was a better Nancy Drew than Nancy Drew was, she would say. So she liked it when people talked to her about other books and series. So, she was really, it was so interesting. And just everything she's done in her life, being like a real life Nancy Drew, and her travel, her going down to Central America on these archaeological trips, her picking up flying in the 1960s and becoming a pilot, and her adventures doing that. She had a lot of adventure later in life, and it's been interesting to research her for the biography, just finding out all these interesting things behind the scenes that even people haven't written about yet or talked about. So that's been pretty fascinating.
That's cool. And I think you'd said she signed some books for you all, and the people in the group. So, wow.
Yes, she did. She signed books for everybody. I don't remember how many everybody brought, or if we had a limit just to help her out. I did not bring nearly enough, because now I'm trying to I've become in this mindset of, I want to collect every book she wrote for Nancy Drew that she signed. That's kind of a difficult thing to do, because it means somebody's going to have to let go of one of their signed books to be able to acquire it. And that's not always easy. I managed to get the first 7 signed by her through, I had number 1 already, but another collector was deciding to downsize. So that I lucked into that. And over the years, I've found one here or there that somebody's been selling. And anyhow, but it was cool to have her sign these books that she wrote so many years ago. And I think for everybody that was there, they probably brought their favorites or, something to that effect. And we're excited to be able to have a signed Millie book.
Yeah, that's pretty special. That's pretty amazing. And I think I'd seen where you talked recently about on Facebook, maybe, where there was a first edition, like, dust jacketed copy of The Secret of the Old Clock. I don't remember if you said it was signed or not, but it was up on eBay recently, which is pretty amazing.
Right. There was a collector, his collection became available out in California. And so, what was funny about it was there was 2 old clocks. One had a reproduction dust jacket on it. So the dust jacket wasn't original, but the book was a first printing, and it was signed by her.
Oh, wow.
So that was interesting. And then there was another one for sale that was an actual first printing book and dust jacket.
Wow.
And that, I think the ending price on that was $6,877. And it was announced, Betsy announced it just a day or two ago on the groups, but Betsy of Books on Bay in Savannah bought the book. So it's going to be on display in Savannah for anybody that gets to come to her shop and check it out. They get to, see it. And I think that's pretty cool. So I was excited for Betsy. I don't know who purchased the reproduction with the signed book. I'm not sure who got that. But anyhow, it was kind of fun to see these 2 auctions. You're always interested in seeing how Old Clock is going to sell at auction, I guess, because over the last, 30 years nearly, I've seen some some sell at eBay, and the prices have been high or low. It just depended on what's going on, but it's always fun for collectors to see how it's going to end up.
Yeah. I guess it's rare when they come up for auction too.
The dust
really
jackets, what's really rare or scarce anyhow. The book itself in a first printing, just buy it without the dust jacket, comes up semi-often, way more than the dust jacket. I think there's only like 13 known copies that exist with a dust jacket that we're aware of. And there may be some more, probably. There has to be more in the wild, but how many of those exist, I don't know. But my guess is not a lot, because the underside of these dust jackets back then had lists of books. And it was almost encouraging kids to maybe take the thing off the book and use the underside as a checklist and, buying list, whatever. And I think that probably made a lot less dust jackets survive. Plus, they just, in general, are hard to survive that long with a lot of wear and tear. So, I mean, I bet there were people that just took that thing off and threw it away not even thinking this is going to be collectible someday. So it's a very small group of people that will probably ever be able to own an original dust jacket for that book. And so they're just very, very, so even if the condition isn't minty, it's not perfect, people will still buy it, because it's not like they're going to be able to get one the next week. I think one hasn't come up for sale in about 5 or 6 years till the one recently. So they just don't come up for sale that often.
Yeah. Wow, that's cool. Now, I'm going to kind of segue into some questions more about some of the themes and things within the books, but I've talked about this on the podcast several times, and I have a theory. But what is up with all the boating accidents, and why do you think there are so many in the original 56 books?
Yeah, that's a good question. Every time she came near the water, something happened. And it's kind of funny, because people say there's like a thing that we do at these conventions where we always have something like a boat or a water, but we don't have accidents. I think it's just another way to have those foibles or whatever to cause trouble for Nancy, to be able to not get that clue or catch that person that she's after, delay finding a clue, those kinds of things. But yeah, there's always something going on with the boat. It's either it's out of gas, or something's not working right, or somebody sideswipes it or capsizes it. Like in The Secret of Mirror Bay, and they're stolen. She had the boat, their sailboat was stolen, and then found over in this little area after a while when they go searching for it, like in the mud and all dirty and everything. So there was always something about boats, and I don't know what the fascination was with that necessarily, but yeah. And it's funny because, like I said, people joke about the fact that at our conventions, almost all of them, there's some boat ride that we're doing. And I didn't even think of that consciously. Like, I happen to do that a lot. We didn't have anything like that last year though. But yeah, it's kind of funny how that works. But the closest we came to a boating disaster, and it wasn't, but when we were in New Orleans the last time in 2016, we went on this swamp tour, and all of a sudden a storm came blowing through, and it was cloudy, there was lightning, there was wind, there was rain, and we were rocking in this little boat, and luckily it was kind of enclosed, and we had the rockiest boat ride to get back to shore in the middle of this storm, and people just loved it. They were like, oh my god, this is so exciting. But we didn't capsize, we didn't have any trouble. But
I've been on one of those swamp tours, and it's like, that's not somewhere you definitely don't want to capsize.
I know all the alligators. The alligators. I know.
And it's kind of funny how, I don't know at what point, but I noticed since I was reading the books in order, it was like the boating accidents would still sometimes occur, but then it kind of became more car accidents, I guess, as Nancy, started driving around more and stuff. So
yeah, there was anything mode of transportation she was on, there was something. I mean, they even on a train, they had the train wreck in the old version of Hollow Oak. And so it's like there's always something, happening to poor Nancy or friends.
Her friends put up with a lot, just being her friend.
I know.
So speaking of common themes within the books, there are some things even in the revised text that haven't necessarily aged well, which, I mean, that's to be expected with books written nearly 100 years ago. For example, some of the offhand comments that George makes about Bess, but if the books had been revised later, do you think some of these things would have been omitted? Or
it's hard to say. I mean, it's possible, definitely. And some of the like with the way George is with Bess, still exists because they only revised the first 34. So some of that, especially in the Harriet books, I don't know. She seemed to really like that comedic relief between the two, or whatever. That's what that's what the whole point of that was for. I think it was just a little something to make you laugh or be silly.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that's a good question though, but it does still exist in some of the regular books that weren't revised. I don't know. Like if they had been revised later, I imagine, like if they were revised right now, let's say, they would probably tone that down a lot or get rid of the whole Bess is 5 pounds overweight and always on a diet crap. They probably would. It seems like to me in the was it in the Girl Detective series, or maybe it was the Diary series? It's almost like they had switched George and Bess because George had this big appetite thing instead of Bess.
Oh,
and they
okay.
kind of changed it a little bit in one of those, at least in one of the books that I happened to read. And so I thought, they switched it. That's interesting. Maybe they thought that with her being such an athlete, she would have a bigger appetite, or because she's needing to get more carbs in her for all her athletic pursuits or whatever. But it's kind of weird.
Huh. So let's see, my next question. So I've been reading and comparing the original textbooks to the revised for my subscription podcast, which is True Drew Files. And I was going to ask, do you have any insights into the revision process and what that was like for the Stratmeyer Syndicate?
Well, on the big hand of it, Harriet wasn't exactly thrilled at them having to go back and revise all of these books because it was a lot of work. But she had a lot of staff at the syndicate to help with all these cut downs. So basically, Grosset and Dunlap pushed it on them and kind of forced the issue, I think, in a way. Because, starting with book 35, they were just doing them as 20 chapter books and around 180 plus or minus pages. And so from then on, that's how it was. So then, of course, they wanted to go back and then make the first 34 the same way. And the main motivation for this was money. It was monetary because it was much cheaper to produce a shorter book because they had been 25 chapters and 200 to 220 plus pages in general. And so basically it was a money issue. And secondly, there was the printing plate issue. Printing plates were starting to wear out for some of the older books especially. And so kind of also involved that issue where printing plates were getting pretty bad for a particular book. They'd go ahead and revise that. And so they could redo and have new plates and everything. And so it started out as like the first 3 and then 4 books and then number 6. And then it just went all out of order after that. And I think that was kind of where the printing plate issue came into effect, is where if one particular book was getting pretty bad, they would go ahead and just revise that one. So they didn't do it in order, basically, after the first few.
Okay.
Yeah. So they started being published in 1959, the revisions, and it went through like 1977. So nearly 20 years of this process of doing this. And it's why you find some like original text versions later on down in the picture cover era. There was a lot of those were still in print when they went into the picture covers. And like the Twin Thriller Book Club's number 13 in that series is the original version because it was revised pretty late past when they put them into that format. So there's kind of interesting things like that, little anomalies with it. But yeah, so basically they of course had the opportunity to update the books a bit and make them more relevant in some ways. I mean, they had kind of done that over the years with different art covers and things, but now they had a chance to kind of remove old outdated language like electric lights, which weren't a novelty anymore, things like that. And then of course, racial prejudicial stuff, stereotypes, things like that, they could, remove from those books as well. So that was an opportunity to do that as well. And so in a lot of ways, they just they chopped them down, they cut out parts. Some, when you read them side by side, the original and revised, you'll see that a lot of the stuff from the original is still in the revised, but they've cut sentences down or cut paragraphs shorter. Maybe they've cut out some little extra scenes here and there to make it faster paced. But a lot of the writing, even some whole paragraphs, still transfer over into the revised. They weren't complete. Like they weren't all new stories. There was some that were all new stories. And so, for example, Broken Locket in the original became a completely different story in the revised because of adoption laws, because there were these kids and this adoption type issue in the original version that wouldn't fly with laws when they revised it. So they just made an all new story. Hollow Oak became an all new story. She was in Canada looking at land she had won in a contest in the original.
Oh, wow.
And in the revised, she's in Cairo, Illinois at an archaeology dig. And it's a completely different story. So some of them definitely changed a lot when they revised. Not all, but some of them. And sometimes that was due to, laws or little issues with the original plot.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So it's probably hard to generalize and say, I like the original text better as a whole or the revised, but are there certain titles where you found yourself liking one more than the other?
Yes. So I grew up with the revised versions, as far as I remember. And, I always liked those. That got me interested in Nancy. But when I was able to read the original versions, I realized just how much better some of them are, just the writing style, the way they flow. But like Lilac Inn, the original is good, but the revised version is like almost a totally different story with there's Lilac Inn that's in it, but they're at the Lilac Inn in the revised version. And there's more going on at Lilac Inn. In the original, it's kind of this just little place that's mentioned, and then somebody's there for lunch, and, there's chicken dinners or their specialty, and you get all that, but you don't have this mystery taking place there, which I liked as the revised version. I liked that it was at Lilac Inn and all the stuff that went on. So I that's one. And Shadow Ranch is another one where I really like. The original is fine, but I really like the newer story in the revised version where there's this cowboy outlaw and he's got this treasure that's hidden, and the phantom horse and all this stuff made it kind of more fun in a way. And so there are some where I like the revised versions better. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because those were the first two that jumped to my mind, because you can't beat a shark-shaped submarine in the revised. No. I like it, and that's just amazing.
I know, that was some of these quirky things that they put in these books were so funny. I agree.
So what are some characteristics that you think define Nancy Drew?
Well, Nancy is very stubborn, and she wants to get to the bottom of things, and it doesn't matter how much you do to try to throw her off her game. She's still going to laser focused on getting it done and solving it and bringing justice to these poor victims and nabbing the crooks and saving the day. She's very bold and adventurous and very intelligent, and she's respected by her elders, who often treat her as an equal. And those are things, at least in the classic series, and so those are things that are really super cool to a kid who's reading these mysteries, because as a kid, you're generally not considered an equal like adults, and you don't get to just go off and have adventures on your own or with your friends like Nancy does. And so it's exciting, and you get to see her being able to do all these great things, and it kind of inspires you that you want to do that at some point. And so I think those are some of the great characteristics. She's a good, loyal friend, and she's kind of a role model, although some people might not say that traipsing around dark alleys after suspects is a good thing for kids. You don't want your kids doing that, but most of us didn't run out and do that. So, but other than that, she was a good role model, and just being a loyal friend and helping others in need. And I think those are qualities that resonate with people.
I agree. So do you have another favorite character in the series aside from Nancy?
Favorite character besides Nancy? Well, Carson Drew. I always liked Carson Drew, and I think that's probably what inspired me to be an attorney. Maybe he was the famous mystery case attorney, and it seemed pretty cool. He was always bringing mysteries Nancy's way, and I always maybe inspired by that a little bit. Outside of Carson, I think I always liked Hannah. She was this perfect, mom stand-in, because Nancy's mom had passed away, but Hannah was this baker, and she could whip up all these great treats and midnight snacks, and she always worried about Nancy. But I always thought Hannah was kind of a cool character. It would be great to have a Hannah growing around. So I think when it comes to Bess and George, I don't know. They're so opposite of Nancy. They're like foils. They're different sides of the coin. Bess is the dreamy, romantic, and fraidy cat, and then George is this blunt, brash, tomboy, athletic person. And Nancy kind of fell in the middle of them, maybe with qualities on both sides. But I don't really have a favorite between Bess and George. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think Carson and Hannah were probably my next favorites in the series.
Yeah, I actually said one of my favorite relationships in the books is the one between Nancy and Carson. And I feel like Carson trusts Nancy's capabilities even in the original text, which is really forward thinking for the 1930s. And I think you could also argue that the Nancy Drew books are about the relationships within the pages just as much as the mysteries. And do you have a favorite? I mean, you've kind of already answered a favorite relationship, Nancy and Carson, and I mean there's Nancy and Ned, but I feel like that really knits the books together.
I think so. I mean, it starts out in the very beginning of the first book with her and then Carson pretty soon into the book, talking about the case and discussing the legalities and all of that. And it's just the relationship between father and daughter was very respectful. He really treated her like an equal and wanted to involve her in his work and get help from her. He helped her, although he was often out of town on business trips when she needed help.
Yeah.
It's like it's left her to be able to figure it out with her own wits and solve the case without her dad necessarily got kidnapped in Hidden Staircase. But yeah, so I think a lot of that original relationship with Nancy and Carson came from Millie in writing that original book, because Millie's dad, she grew up in this tiny town in Ladora, Iowa, very rural and lots of farming and, stuff around that town. But her dad was a country doctor. And so she used to ride along with him and go on his calls to people around the countryside and get involved in that aspect of it. And I think Millie and her dad had a similar relationship, where he kind of treated her as an equal and respected her and, inspired her to go on and do what she really wanted to do. And so, yeah, I think it kind of comes from that, which is sort of interesting.
So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, but you got to consult on the 2007 Emma Roberts Nancy Drew movie, which is really, really cool. But can you tell us what that process was like?
That was pretty neat. I've never done anything like that before or since, but basically it came out in 2007, but around 2005, I heard from an assistant to Jerry Weintraub, who was producer of the movie, and she had been to my website. She had seen it. She liked what I had on there and my knowledge and all that. So she was reaching out to me to see if I could work with Andy Fleming, the director of the film, because he was revising a script that had been written by Tiffany Paulson and kind of redoing some of it for this movie. And so he needed someone like myself that could point out things, because he was a big fan of the classic books, not so much the modern stuff. And I think that's why you see kind of a retro-ish look to her and the way she is in the film a bit. But anyhow, he would want to ask questions. He would want to know certain things about some of the classic books and get suggestions and this and that. So I basically agreed to help out, and I got sent the working draft of the script at that time and had read through it. And then, I was ready to go. And so he would just ask questions, and Hannah was, he was questions about Hannah. And then there was George. They were going to call her Georgina or something ridiculous. And I was like, that is not how George should be called. So there were times when I could step in and say, wait a minute, that's not how that is. You shouldn't be doing that. He didn't always listen to me because he had his own artistic license, as he put it, as Hollywood always thinks they have. And we see how well that's gone over all these years. But so I would make suggestions and, then so that's kind of how it went. He would give me a call or whatever, or email me and get information from me, and we'd chat about it. And that's really where my consulting went in, was working with him while he was revising the script. And it's kind of hard when you read a script sometimes to totally visualize how it's going to actually be when it's filmed and put together in some ways. But I did get to go out to the set and spend about 2 or 3 days getting to see them filming on the set at, out in the Burbank area where they have all the studios and stuff. And that was really neat because I had never been on a movie set and I had no idea what that would be like. But I got to see the secret passage. They had that all built. And then there was like the attic area. They had that on the set, and some of the other places where they filmed some of the scenes on soundstage. And so that was really neat to get to just see what it's like to film a movie. And you don't realize how tedious it can be. Like they can spend hours just filming a few lines in this one little scene, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's almost insane. But I got to meet Emma Roberts, and I got to meet the guy who played her dad. I'm drawing a blank right now on that.
Yeah.
What's his name?
I can't remember off the top of my
I
head,
know it. I was like, how am I not remembering this? But that was really cool. He was nice. He was kind of in pajamas and a River Heights Police Academy t-shirt or something like that for his scene, because they were kind of like, I guess they had woken up and they were filming that scene where he's like in a robe and a t-shirt, and she's in pajamas and stuff. And so they were doing that scene. And then Jeffrey Kurland, the costume designer for the film, he saw me in there and he came in, and I forget what I was wearing. I think I was wearing some kind of like tweedy trousers. And I had these little pointy little coral shoes, and I was sitting there with my legs crossed to the side, and he came walking in, and he's like, oh my gosh, you're sitting so Nancy like. And I was like, okay. They were almost like loafer patent looking, but they were like little pointy toed low heels. Anyhow, it was funny. So he goes, do you want to see the costume book? And so I was like, oh yeah, that'd be great. So he brings me this giant binder where they have all these Polaroids and shots of the different costumes and stuff for the movie in it, and from the different scenes they've been filming. And I got to look through that, and that was really neat to see that. He was a real nice guy. And then, there was the actor that played the bad guy, of course. And he was on, I didn't meet him, but he was around part of the set. And they were complaining because, I don't know, maybe he'd put on 5 pounds and they were having trouble getting him in whatever outfit they were trying to get him in. And I just remember like, this is interesting. But it was just neat to speak to the assistants and the staff. And, lemon bars were in the film. And I baked, my mom has the perfect lemon bar recipe. It's so delicious. So I baked these little lemon bars and cut them into little mini bite-sized pieces and had them in a tin that I brought the director. And so he liked the lemon bars, but that was kind of fun. I know. So it was just really fun just to see how a movie is filmed, and you get to, learn that side of it, because I didn't know a lot about that. And then meeting Emma was interesting. She's like, what are you doing? Because I had a little notebook and I was taking notes because I was going to write about my experience. And so I was telling her, and, I was the consultant and I was writing an article. So she sat around and asked me questions for a little while and talked to me. And that was interesting to meet her. She was pretty young when she was filming this. And I got to see the car. They had it parked outside. And so that was kind of fun to see her Nash convertible that they used in the film. Yeah. And then Corky and the guy playing Ned, they came in at one point, but I didn't actually meet them. But they also had their stunt double. And so the little Corky in his little leather jacket, they had this little guy, this older guy in his little leather jacket that was his stunt double. And I thought that was hilarious that he had a stunt double. But I saw that guy running around. But it was fun. It was an interesting experience. So it was kind of a hit or miss film with fans, I think, because she was younger. She's still in school. She's like a fish out of water, which she never was in the books. Yeah. So there were parts of it that, I knew weren't going to resonate well with some of the fans. But I thought it was overall a pretty cute little film. It wasn't the Nancy Drew I would like to see filmed for a movie, but it was cute.
Which that kind of brings me to my next question. Do you have a favorite movie or TV show adaptation that's come out so far?
I think probably for TV, my favorite would be between the 70s shows, which were the closest we've ever seen to Book Nancy ever. Although people complained about Pamela Sue Martin's hair color, she was brunette. But then as those series filmed over the first 2 seasons, you saw her hair get lighter and lighter, like blonder highlights added to her hair. And I imagine, I think that was because fans were complaining about the hair color to the producers. But anyhow, that, and I really liked the 2002 pilot that was just aired as a pilot and nothing else happened, but it was Maggie Lawson as Nancy Drew. I kind of like that. She was off at college in that one, which was also different, but similar to the On Campus series, I guess, but different. I liked it. For movies, so I guess we've just had the Warner Brothers movies. We've had the Emma Roberts movie, and then we had that Hidden Staircase one with Sophia Lillis that was recent. Yes. I would say the 30s movies are my favorite. I just like seeing it back at the time. These were in their heyday. And you see all the vintage everything, the clothing, the cars and everything. They're kind of more like slapstick comedies in part. Ned's like the straight man to her silliness. And so she wasn't exactly like Book Nancy, but I loved the vintage aspect of them. And I thought Benita did a decent job as Nancy. But I think the Emma Roberts movie will always have a place in my heart because I consulted on it, and that was pretty pretty cool to see and learn about the movie process. But I would say those are favorites.
Yeah. So I guess if you were to pick a decade, I know you said you really favored the 30s movies, because I agree. I think there needs to be an adaptation that's set somewhere between the 1930s to 1980s. I think it would be really cool to see. But is there a favorite decade for you as far as that goes?
As far as Nancy goes, I think her best decades were the 30s and 40s. I think that was, and she was at her best, and the mysteries were wonderful. They were so gothic and suspenseful, and it was melodrama to those. I think a period piece focusing on those 2 decades or somewhere in there would be awesome. The Broadway play that's being done, that's going to come out hopefully in the next year or two, is set in the 40s. So I think that'll be really cool to have a period piece for that. And it fits so well. Other decades for Nancy Drew, I don't know, the 80s was kind of neat because we had the Files series coming out, and the Nancy Drew Files was so radically different. I mean, they were more for teenagers, and she was solving murders. But I grew up reading those, and I have a fondness for those. So I think in 80s, Nancy Drew would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I could almost see that being a good TV movie or something. That would be great.
Right.
So talking about the Her Interactive Nancy Drew games, how did you become aware that they existed?
So when they were first coming out, somebody that worked for Her Interactive sent me some information about the games and some little sneak peeks and things.
Yeah.
So I kind of became aware of it. And I thought that's really neat, because that was for that first game, Secrets Can Kill. And of course, it was based on the Files book. And I always liked that book. So I thought that was really neat. And that's kind of how I became informed about it, or kind of got some insider information and was excited that these games were coming out. And then they just kind of went on to take on a life of their own. They all the games over the years and where we're at today, and a huge fan following.
Yeah, it's fun to look through some of the later paperbacks and see the advertisements for whatever game was coming out. So now, do you have a favorite Nancy Drew game? I know that's a hard question because they're all so good.
I know that it is a hard one. I still think Secrets Can Kill is always going to be a favorite because it was the first one, and I vaguely remember playing that one or trying to play it. And and then of course they remastered it years later and kind of reissued it. But I'm kind of taking a liking to the Ghost Dogs of Moonlight since I've been dealing with that so much for planning this convention. I like the games that have like the more spooky, kind of like I like the books. I like the books with the more spooky backgrounds and spooky stuff. So I think Ghost Dogs is definitely up in the top for me. And just trying to flesh that game part out and the way they are sleuthing around the lake. The bugs thing was kind of gross, all the bugs, and I don't like that. Don't like bugs. But maybe we won't have any bugs at the convention.
Oh, good.
I don't know. There might be some. I have some helpers working on that right now. So they may just throw some bugs. I'm sure they're going to throw some bugs in there somehow. Not real, I'm sure. They'll be fake. But that whole, just bringing that and seeing how they use parts of the ghost story itself and Mystery by Moonlight, and then came up with their own kind of thing. So that's definitely a favorite. Minus the bugs.
Yes, minus the bugs. So as far as cover artists for the Nancy Drew books go, do you have a favorite between Russell Tandy, Bill Gillies, and Rudy Nappy?
That's a good question. Probably, I grew up with mostly Nappy and a couple Bill Gillies covers that survived into the time I was reading them. And so I like Nappy's art. I like her as that little plucky looking girl with a little red-haired flip hair, whatever. That's what but when I discovered Tandy, it was like, wow, like you have this sophisticated fashionista, that looks beautiful on these covers and looks older than 18 to me. She looks way more sophisticated. I own the, I'll show you I have the original art for Hidden Staircase. That's always been a favorite by Nappy. So, it's hard to pick because of that nostalgia from childhood and what I grew up with. I really like Nappy. Gillies is probably my least favorite of the three, and no offense to Gillies, but all of his covers, the ones that he did, often have Nancy just going, with her mouth open, and there's been jokes about her looking like a blow up doll on the diary cover and stuff, and it's just, it's just all that open mouth, shocked looking Nancy. And I don't know, of the Gillies, I would say maybe Lilac Inn or Hidden Staircase are ones I kind of like from his, or O'Clock, but some of them are just kind of, I don't know. But I think Tandy has become my favorite overall. Just absolutely beautiful. My favorite, like you were saying earlier, your favorite is the Old Attic cover that he did. It's probably my favorite favorite of his. I would say Old Clock is a big second. Just she looks so perfect on that cover. And it was fun to research Tandy and, kind of like who was his model? Who was his muse for those early ones? We know Grace Horton was working for him by the time of Old Attic, but trying to figure out who was the inspiration for the early Nancy Drews. I wrote an article about that. And there's this French artist, Maurice Millier, that did these sort of windswept, like the scarf flowing in the wind type of drawings.
Yeah.
And had all these little statuettes and art that were really big back in that time of Tandy. And I think he took inspiration from that guy. And whether he actually had a girl standing there for Old Clock and some of the ones after that, I don't know. But his looks so similar to that style. But yeah, I like Tandy a lot.
So I've seen you post on your Instagram and your Facebook pages that you run that I think it may have been a little bit of time ago since by the time this episode airs, but you had acquired some foreign editions of Nancy Drew books. So can you tell us more about those?
Yes, I recently acquired a bunch of the Norwegian Nancy Drew books. I absolutely love the Norwegian covers. Some of them mimic the exact scenes from the classic books, and then some of them are slightly different, or maybe they're mimicking a scene from the books inside the books or something. But yeah, the the Norwegian covers, they're super neat. I had a bunch already that are in Toledo. And then I have a bunch from other countries, like the Danish ones, like the Swedish ones, the Kitty, the French ones, the UK's, and on and on. So I have a big smattering of other ones there too, besides the Norwegian, but they're not all complete because kind of hard to find foreign covers or find sources. And then the shipping from overseas is almost prohibitive in some cases. But the Norwegian ones, we see a lot on eBay because there's at least one or two sellers that often sell extra Norwegian ones from Norway. And so it's been easy to find some that way. In fact, I got quite a few that way. But recently I connected with a source in Norway who was able to, had a bunch of extras of these, and he was able to sell me a ton of his extras. Wow. And I can't remember how many, but it was a giant box full of them. And it completed a bunch of the ones I was missing from what I had in Toledo. So I'm super excited. I've been boxing those up to ship off for the event in April so people can see more of these Norwegian covers because they're super neat. And there's a lot of Norwegians that have basically, Minnesota and some of those states around Ohio. There's a lot of Norwegians and that history there. So I'm hoping some of them will be excited when they get to go to the library, maybe if they're interested in Nancy Drew and they get to see these books. Yeah. There was a couple of CDs of readings of the books. Of course, it's in Norwegian, but and other special assorted books related to the series or the artists for those. And so anyhow, I've got some real neat Norwegian stuff that I'm going to be shipping off, as well as some odds and ends from like Japanese, Spain or Spanish editions, Argentinian, just all kinds of stuff I'm sending off to add to the foreign editions part of it. So adding a little bit of multiculturalness to the collection there, and people can see what she looked like or how she was portrayed in other countries, which is kind of interesting. Like, for example, the Italian one, she kind of looks harsh and was like a biker chick or something. It's a little rougher looking than you would expect. Yeah. Like Norwegian covers, she's very smooth and sophisticated and really, looks like Nancy, you would expect Nancy to look. But it's funny to see her depicted in other countries.
I have a while before I catch up to you, but I did have a listener that was kind enough to send me a Greek copy of the Bungalow Mystery. Oh, nice. And so it was really neat. I think it depicts the scene where she's in the cellar with Jacob Aborn and what is the bad guy's name? It's a very memorable name too. Oh,
Stumpy Dowd.
Yeah, Stumpy Dowd.
Yeah, Stumpy Dowd. Yeah.
So it was interesting that they chose that scene for the cover, but very
cool. It is interesting to see like how they decide on the cover. I'm trying to think. I think there is a foreign edition, and I'm not remembering which country it is now. But in the original Shadow Ranch, she's punching a villain, and I think that's on the cover. It's just funny that they chose that to be the cover.
Yeah. So this kind of leads into my next question, but what are some of the scariest situations that Nancy has found herself in the series, in your opinion?
Well, in the first book, she's locked in this closet and left to starve. So she hadn't been able to get out of the closet. Theoretically, she might have starved, you know. Of course, she gets help from Jeff Tucker getting out of there and trying to use a closet rod as a lever. But that wasn't the most perilous. But as depicted in the original, it was kind of a scary scene with these rough and tumble robbers. And you didn't know was, struggling and getting thrown in the closet. It's a little scary probably for kids.
Yeah.
Probably the unmasking in Redgate Farm in the cave where they're infiltrating this, naturist colony and they're wearing those masks, and all of a sudden everybody's told to take their masks off and they're having to unmask, and Nancy's racing away through the tunnel was a little scary. When you fast forward to Black Keys, she's actually tortured in the original version. They're twisting a bracelet on her arm, inflicting torture on her to get her to come clean about some stuff. And that's never happened in she's never been tortured before. That wasn't in the revised version, of course, but that was a little scary there. Yeah. I mean, there's always been some situation of peril when she's knocked unconscious so many times. How she survived all these head knockouts all these years. Always getting knocked out, getting kidnapped, getting tied up. I would say probably one of the even more perilous ones is the original, especially of Lilac Inn, where she's on the boat and she's bound and gagged and it's on fire and they're going to sink the boat and just let her sink to the bottom. And then, of course, she gets rescued. But that was pretty scary.
Yeah. So as far as some of the crazier out there Nancy Drew books, I think for me, I would probably have to say the Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion, the revised. That one's very out there with the explosive oranges and stuff. And Mystery of the Tolling Bell, the revised, I haven't read the original yet, but is there any that stick out for you as being really out there?
Pretty much anything from the 70s onward is pretty out there. Now, going back to the early ones, when Edna Stratemeyer's daughter, was more involved with Nancy Drew in the very beginning and created and worked on the Nancy Drew books more in the 30s than her sister Harriet. Edna was kind of into spiritualism. So we get these storylines like in the Ivory Charm, where there's the life-saving stuff in the charm, and that was kind of out there for a book at the time, but she was into spiritualism and stuff like that. But when we get to the 70s, I don't know, Harriet really liked these kind of out there ideas and plots. So we've got, like you mentioned, the revised of Moss Mansion. She had traveled to Florida, and so she was incorporating stuff. And the mad scientists, the exploding oranges, the NASA stuff was kind of out there. But if you read Sky Phantom, that's a little out there. There's this phantom in the sky, but it's this gun running, gang and dealing in arms and all this sort. And then they're finding oil in a cave, and Bess is having a major meltdown over Dave, her boyfriend, and this other guy at this dude ranch, and it was just kind of ridiculous. And then yeah, that was a weird one. Even a strange message in a parchment was a little dingy with the sheep farm. But then they had the mechanical birds that would attack people in that book that the mobster people would release to attack people. The guys that were shaking down the farmers. It was just really weird. When you get to the Wanderers, you've got, and some people love this. It's a cult classic, I guess, but the Flying Saucer Mystery, number 58, is also considered a little wacky because that was one of Harriet's last few that she wrote, and she was getting a little off, I think, at that point. But the dream sequence where they apparently inhale this bad swamp gas in the swamp and have these wacky dreams where they're flying birds, human birds, and they're just the stuff in that book related to that is really wacky. And the Indian throwing nuts at them, and it was a strange book. Those are definitely some of the top wacky ones, I think you could say. Even Mystery of the Glowing Eye was a little weird with the science-based glowing eye and everything. That was kind of odd, but Harriet seemed to like some of that strange sci-fi elements. But, Double Jinx was also a little wacky with her dancing across a field with Merv Marvel, one of the villains, and the construction guy that's like this 10-foot tall thug that's throwing people around and doing weird stuff. That whole, and the birds and the ornithosis and all that was strange. There was some definitely strange ones.
And didn't Nancy and Ned Ed go over a dam in that book? I'm pretty sure. Like
to escape
Yeah.
there. I think he pushed him in the water. That big thug guy who looked like a giant. Something from the giant. What was it? Where the peas or the peas that grew or the beans that grew up into the giant.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of the name of that. Anyhow, it was like a giant from that or something. It was very weird. So some of Harriet's later books definitely had some odd themes in them. They were a little out there and wacky plots for sure. I mean, they were definitely memorable, but
what can you tell us about Harriet Stratmeyer's role in the success of the Nancy Drew character?
So Harriet stepped in and her sister Edna when their father passed away. So Edward was involved in the beginning. He outlined the first 4 books, and then, he kind of became sick that spring, pneumonia and other complications. But, he died nearly 2 weeks after Nancy Drew debuted in 1930. So he had an assistant named Harriet Otis Smith, another Harriet, who was really a great assistant. She stepped in, of course, and helped the sisters in that transition where they're trying to, basically it's the Great Depression. They're trying to sell this company. It's not easy to do at that time. They're trying to find a suitable buyer, and they just can't. There's one big fan of Edward Stratemeyer. His name was Wallace Palmer. He was a huge fan of Stratemeyer and his books. He offered to buy it, but they didn't take him seriously. And it's probably just as well, because who knows what would have happened at that point. But so the sisters decide to carry on their father's company. And so Harriet Otis Smith, the assistant, kind of helps them learn the ropes. They hadn't really worked for their dad in any major capacity, certainly not Edna, but Harriet had done some home editing on some things at different times. She had some sense of it, but they weren't really writers. They weren't really editors, and they had to kind of step into the role of editor and creating plot outlines and learning all of that. So basically Harriet Otis Smith, she finished the outline for Shadow Ranch and, transitioned them. They were keeping the company in New Jersey, and it had been in New York. And so Harriet Otis Smith did not want to commute to New Jersey. So she left the company, and it became the sisters by the fall of 1930, and they were on their own. And so basically, they just carried on. It was pretty amazing. And so Edna became heavily involved on the Nancy Drew side in writing most of the outlines that Mildred wrote through the end of the 1930s until Edna got married. And then within a couple of years, her husband and her moved to Florida. She became more like a silent partner. So early 40s onward, it was mostly Harriet in the office until later years when she took on some partners and she had assistants and secretaries. But so Harriet and Edna, and then Harriet, once Edna became more of a silent partner, just carried on this business and ran it like their father. They kept up the same kind of style and patterns of how they did things, and kept the ghostwriters on. The publishers all wanted the current ghostwriters to continue on that were already writing when he passed, and they kept all the ghostwriters and moved forward and created some new series on their own, like the Dana Girls, and they just basically were these 2 women competing in a male dominated publishing industry, which was pretty cool because they held their own, especially Harriet, who would push back against Grosset on things over the years and was rather stubborn, especially when she started writing some of the Nancy Drew books and became more, less of a business owner dealing with the series, and more of it was more personal to her when she was writing them, and continued on until her death. And then shortly thereafter, Simon & Schuster bought the syndicate from the remaining partners. And if Harriet had not stepped in and done what she did, and her sister Edna, I don't know where the syndicate would have ended up, because it was the Depression. It was a very difficult time to take up a business like that. They were like a book packager, and they would come up with the outlines and the plots and form them out to the ghostwriters, and then have the different publishers they were working with publish these books. And it was like a family business. It was not like a corporate entity running this. So they got a lot more attention to detail and more love out of all these books and series for those decades that she was behind it. And, once it went to Simon & Schuster, it's a different environment. It's more corporate, and they have lots of other books and series they're also publishing. So it's not the only thing they're focusing on. And so there's a difference in attention to detail and continuity and style. And you have all these new modern versions and spin-offs that Simon & Schuster did. like Harriet would have never accepted the Files series because, Nancy Drew solving murders and all this romance and stuff she didn't want in the books. And she probably rolled a little bit at that. And of course, some of the modern versions of the CW show.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, Harriet would not have approved of that. She had a lot of control over the 70s show in the script process and what they did with Nancy Drew. She was very protective. So I think if we hadn't had Harriet all those years, I don't know if Nancy would have survived, at least not in the way that she has.
So I just have 3 more questions, but I've got to know, are you team blonde Nancy or team strawberry blonde Nancy?
I think I'm team everything. I just like all Nancy. I love the look from the 30s with her as a blonde, but the Titian hair, the red hair, I grew up with that on all the covers mostly, and I like that too. So I guess I'd say I'm not, I don't take any sides there. It doesn't matter the hair color for me, not really. Yeah. I mean, having black hair or brown hair would be weird because it doesn't make sense, but as long as it's reddish or blonde, I'm okay.
So we all love Nancy's classic blue roadster, but if she was to be adapted to even more modern times, what kind of modern blue car could you see her driving?
That's a good question. I had morphed into a Mustang at one time, and then it a Girl Detective series, it was like a hybrid car.
Yeah.
And then for modern, I don't know, probably some sporty little convertible. Maybe they still make Mustangs, so maybe she'd still be driving a Mustang. I could see that. I could also see her in maybe an SUV. It's safer probably than a small sporty car. Carson might have been more into safety here in the modern era. But I don't know. I just picture her freedom and just being in a little zippy car.
Yeah.
It's hard to picture her in a truck or an SUV or anything else but a convertible of some sort.
Yeah. So we talked earlier about things that you think define Nancy's character. And one thing that stuck out to me as a kid and several other people that I've talked to is how Nancy could just pick up talents and skills with ease, like just seemingly on the first try. So do you think there's anything that Nancy is bad at?
Well, in a way, she's bad at solving mysteries because she didn't do it on the first page, right? It took her a while. No, she's good at solving mysteries because she's so determined. Something that she would be bad at, I don't know. She's very, like you say, she always developed a talent for whatever mystery she was doing. Like in 52, Forgotten City, she knows 28 Mexican dialects or something.
Yes.
It's like, are you kidding me? These little hobbies or things she's good at became more pronounced in the Harriet era and those books than in the originals. In the originals, she was much more self-deprecating, chided herself, felt stupid that she didn't find this or that. She was more realistic in some of those 30s books, especially. But yeah, she was always popular and good at what she did. And, she could pick up whatever talent. It's hard to say what she would be bad at. And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Because not everybody out there is good at everything, right? But I think by having her be good at something, it was a way to inspire you to maybe be better in what you're not good at in your life. So if she's a tennis whiz and you're struggling at tennis, maybe it motivates you to try harder, practice harder, be more like Nancy. I don't know about the 28 Mexican dialects. Most people are not going to go off and learn all that. Are there 28 Mexican dialects? I don't even know. But that was hilarious. But that's funny. People joke about her being so talented at everything. And she just really was. But sometimes she needed to be talented to be able to best a villain or get a clue or, solve a case. So it was necessary.
I agree with what you said about the 1930s versions because I think it was the original for Secret of Redgate Farm. It really surprised me when I was reading that book that Nancy didn't really solve the code that she found. And in the revised, it was like, oh, she got it at the end of the next chapter. And so that was kind of refreshing. I was like, oh, okay. But at the same time, I was like, no, but she's so good at stuff like that. So it was kind of interesting to see that difference. So
and at the end of Mysterious Letter, the original version, the villain gets away. I mean, and maybe he doesn't, maybe he does, but that was one of those cases where she couldn't nab him and turn him into the police. He kind of jumped into the river, and did he survive? I don't know, but they never showed up in another mystery again. But so that was something. She wasn't good at getting that guy.
Well, that's all the questions that I could come up with. But thank you so much, Jen, for coming on the podcast. And I guess, do you want to let the listeners know where they can find you on your social media pages?
Right. So you can find me and the Nancy Drew Sleuths at, if you go to Nancy Drew Sleuth, SLEUTH.com, I have a section on social media and I have all the links there. But like I'm at Nancy Drew Expert on most things like Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram. And then it's Nancy Drew Sleuths or Nancy Drew Fans for the group on some of the different handles. And so if you go to my website, you'll find all the links. Also, nancydrewfans.com is our group's website where we have all our licensed official merchandise, all our convention information about our zine, The Sleuth, and what we do. And you can find out all about our group. And my website, Nancy Drew Sleuth, you can learn all about Nancy Drew. It's got the history behind the series, stuff about Nancy Drew, the character, all the collecting and format information. You have to figure out what you have if you're trying to figure out how old your books are. Section on all the collectibles, and it just has all sorts of stuff on there. So it's like all about Nancy Drew. And there's also a section for that library collection that I donated to Toledo. And if you want to learn more about our conventions, we have 2 this year. The first is in April in Toledo, April 24th to 26th, and it's the 95th anniversary conference. Lots of events at the Toledo Public Library and some things around town and mystery dinner and lots of fanfare. And then in October is our big fall convention in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and it's based on the witch tree symbol and also the ghost dogs of Moon Lake, ghost dogs of Whispering Oaks, the ghost story behind that, and some other themes that we're bringing in. Another ghost story called Vampire Cave. We're bringing that in, and just lots of fun stuff. We're going to be traveling around, visiting Amish country, having a big mystery dinner as usual, our convention day with speakers and special guests. You can find all of that information to sign up for those at nancydrewfans.com. The April convention, the deadline is March 1st. So by the time this airs, it will already have, hopefully some of those who are listening to this and at that couple days after we're done in Toledo will have been there. I hope to meet lots of new fans. And then of course the deadline to sign up for October is June. It's in June. It's going to be in June. Registration will be debut pretty soon for that. So when this airs, there will still be a couple months to still register for the October event. So hopefully lots of people want to join us. I would love to meet you at one of these. So I hope you get to join us one of these days. That would be awesome.
I'm hoping to definitely make it to the fall one because that just seems so fun. And I saw all the hype from last year's and it just looked like it was such a good time. So
yeah, we had an amazing time in Sleepy Hollow. That was so much fun. It was so beautiful up in the Hudson Valley.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Jen. And to all the listeners out there, I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.